Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Punch, Kick, Choke Chat. My name is Sean Benson. I'm one of your hosts. And if you were following along the week before our host chat, we're trying out a new format with y'all. So we are just going to jump right into our conversation with Professor Chet Schemahorn. How you doing tonight, Professor?
Excellent.
Awesome. So I got one right out of the gate. As somebody who's been through the Gracie combatives, who teaches it, the Gracie bully proof, what do you think about the state of sport BJJ that doesn't include the self-defense aspects that those programs you're so entrenched in are fundamentally based on?
Yeah, starting with a good question.
Yeah, thanks.
So
I was thinking about it.
I've always argued, right? When it comes to that, something that we used to say or would have concerns with would be, when someone starts training martial arts, it takes years and years to get up to a level of proficiency in that art, whatever it might be. And I think the difference with us is on dealing with that violent person that's maybe not so technical. So the moves are more simple and you get into the more foundational core of, to me, what jiu-jitsu is about, where it's efficient movement, using wedges and friction and things like that. So I think when someone's doing competition, they have a tendency to elevate the level of techniques they're practicing. In other words, instead of spending a year on positional control from mount, where I just don't fall off somebody throwing hard, they're working on, maybe a mounted triangle technique or something that finishes. And though that works good in a sportive environment where there's a referee and there's rules, a street fight is something that is much, much different. Mm-hmm. And so the concern then, and I say this because I think someone that, even though they've only done sport their whole life, when someone gets up to black belt level, brown belt, black belt level in jiu-jitsu, they're going to be fine against a novice, no matter what they do.
Right.
The concern's always for the white belts, the new ones coming in. So instead of them spending their time learning foundational movements or base, they're learning berimbolo or some, whatever's the new fly move out of the box. So in that sense, that's the concern, is just how the newer people deal with it. And then, the fear would be they get hurt on the street thinking they can handle themselves and put their head in a bad place, or not deal with the fact that concrete is very unforgiving.
Right. So you have the privilege of being our first BJJ guest that we've had on. So can you help us out a little for people who are tuning in more from a karate or a TKD or that kind of perspective? When you're talking, and I'm talking about these combatives or these bully proof or self-defense, can you just talk a little bit about that versus sport, so that people do know what we're talking about when you're talking about a berimbolo versus positional control?
Yeah, so the idea with self-defense is distance management, especially when we're on our feet. You have to be far enough away that you're not strikeable, but yet close enough that if you need to, you can clinch. And so there's a really interesting distance there. And then once the clinch happens, we're grappling. So if you're dealing with strikes, any space is going to allow for stronger strikes. So tightness. And, when we start talking competition, a good example would even be with judo. Right? Judo came from the original battlefield samurai jiu-jitsu. Most of the throws in that were to throw someone on their neck. And if they were wearing 80 pounds of armor, that was it. You do one throw and you didn't have to deal with that guy anymore. And when judo became a sport so that you could have competition, right? The idea that to throw someone flat was a victory. It's for safety, if I'm not correct. So it's just that twist. And Grand Master Helio always wanted slamming allowed in all his tournaments. Mm. And he was like, you have to be able to defend this. If you ever get slammed one time on the street, you're done. It's over. Yep. There's no doing anything from that. So And then of course you run into insurance issues, and that's inevitably why I think Rorion quit running his tournament. I believe Huron slammed Cameron Earl in a match, and it knocked him out for about 15 minutes. And
Wow.
that was about it.
Right. So what we love to do when we're chatting about these topics is throw them around the horn a bit. So let me run a little with what you said, and just let's call the even sportive development of BJJ the art, where you can play with it, experiment with it, whatever. And then we'll call being slammed on the concrete the self-defense. So how important is it? And let me start with you, Hanshy Legacy, to have an art that's developing that might not include overt elements of street fighting or self-defense, versus just, if it doesn't work for self-defense, get rid of it.
Going to pass on that.
Okay, thanks. Sensei Suino, what do you think?
Well, I've spent my life practicing judo, which is these days a martial sport, right? So it's done on mats. There's, as Professor Chet mentioned, the techniques have been limited and modified for relative safety. And so there's definitely a competitive version of judo that I guess I would say is a little bit sanitized. Not to say a lot of those techniques wouldn't work really, really well on the street, but a lot of them wouldn't, because you don't necessarily want to throw yourself when you're throwing somebody on concrete. And there are decisive versions of the throws where you're trying to throw somebody on the neck, or put them in an arm lock and throw them with that, or break their arm as part of the throw, and you can't do that in sport judo. That hails from self-defense first, right? And I think kind of part of your question is, what if the development of the art is taking place from an art perspective or a sport perspective first, right? But judo comes out of combatives rather than combatives coming out of an art that may be still being developed. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's kind of my perspective on it from a judo point of view.
It's really cool to think about it, whether it's an answer or not. I don't even know. Sensei Dauphin?
I'm going to go back to what we said a couple of shows ago, which is it's the mind, right? And I think Professor Chet said it already, because he talked about, if you're competing for sport, then that's what you train. You train the techniques so that you can win in a sport arena. And if you come in, the art is the art. Like, it was there before all of us, and it's going to be there after all of us. So it's taking care of itself already. It's spitting out the people who aren't part of it and drawing in the people that should be part of it. But I think it's the mind, right? Like if Sensei Suino has a strong mind, Sensei Legacy has a strong mind, their art feeds into that, and then they're training because it's more combative and not sport oriented. If you grab a hold of Sensei Suino, he's going to hit you with the earth. Right? If you grab a hold of Sensei Legacy, he's going to impale his fist through your brain or the middle of your body, and that's because of the way they think, combined with what their art is. Right? And neither of them are thinking about winning the next Olympic gold medal.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Sensei. So yeah, Sensei Schemahorn, like when you've got these guys working out all the different guards and the different tricks, does that feather back into the self-defense, or does that tend to be pretty separate from it? Do you think it helps in the long run? In 50 years, we'll have better self-defense.
It's always possible, but usually the innovation, because there's not the risk, gets that twist where there's not a threat. So why would you worry about it? And the perfect example would be slamming. There's so many guys that will play a guard where the person inside their guard's standing and they're being held up off the ground because they're attached to the hip with their legs. And like, you don't need any skill to put them on the ground hard. And anybody that's going to think that for 1 second they're going to survive somebody that truly wants to hurt them like that, right? That's where you get some ideas and paths they might choose, put them in more harm's way, and by playing a very basic game that's less flash.
Yeah, right on. That's really badass. It's really appropriate that you're our first BJJ guest, because this show's really born out of a classical martial arts mindset for the most part. And that if it isn't going to work, then it's probably something maybe to be shed over time. So it's great that we're talking to you and you're coming at it right from that same perspective, even through a different art. So everybody's tuning in, we're just jumping right into the conversation. And I'm just going to do a quick intro of who's on the call. And then Sensei Dauphin is going to let you know a little bit more about our guest, who you've already heard a little bit from. So my name's Sean Benson, and I'm going to introduce Sensei Randy Dauphin. He's a 7th degree black belt in Legacy Shorin Ryu, as well as Hakatsuru White Crane, and he's a 4th degree black belt in the Aido. Sensei Nicholas Suino, who's an 8th degree black belt, the founder of the Japanese Martial Arts Center, 8th degree in the Aido, 6th degree in Jiu-Jitsu and in Judo. Hanshi Legacy, who's the founder of Legacy Shorin Ryu, and he's a 10th Dan. He's received black belts under Benny Allen, under Richard Kim, and under his 10th Dan he received under Hanshi Anthony Sandoval. And he's also a black belt in the Aido. And I'm going to throw it to you, Sensei Dauphin, to talk a little bit more if I've missed anything and introduce our guest.
I don't think you did. I think that was much better than last week. You must have written it. You must have written it down. And I'm proud of you, Sean, because that's what we do. When you make a mistake, you learn from your mistake and you fix it, right? So I'm excited to introduce Professor Chet, because I want you to listen to some of this stuff, whether you're on YouTube or whenever you listen to this. I want you to listen to this. So Professor Chet's a 3rd Dan in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system, and he studied directly under these two names, both world-renowned masters, Rorion and Helio Gracie. And I often say this: if you don't know those two names and you're a martial artist, you just go throw yourself off a bridge or something. He has the distinction of being part of the very first crop of American students to be promoted to black belt in the Gracie Academy. Professor Chet's journey through Jiu-Jitsu is unique in his own right. And this is another thing I want people to think about. Sensei Legacy and Sensei Suino will relate to this most of all, and me a little bit as well. He started his training watching VHS tapes of Rorion and Royce Gracie, instructional videos. He had some financial limitations early on in his training that restricted him to training 1 week training sessions with the Gracies 4 times a year. So basically, he was a seeker. He knew what he liked. He knew what he wanted. He would go, he would train, he would come back, and he would keep it going, right? Another really interesting thing about Professor Chet, and something not a lot of people actually really realize, is that he's graded with Ed O'Neill, AKA Al Bundy, from Married with Children. And another thing I want to say about that is, you might laugh, but I'd really like to see anybody who's watching this call go fight Ed O'Neill. I'll bet you he'd kick your ass from 10 ways to Sunday. Professor Chet also continues to promote the Gracie system today. And everybody on this call has every confidence he's going to continue to do so for the rest of his life. Training at a distance, I made a comment about that. And Professor Chet, I just want to say, Suino Sensei trained closely with Yamaguchi Sensei, and then for a long time at a distance, had to go to Japan on a plane to actually train with him. Sensei Legacy had to train with Richard Kim and Sensei Sandoval, who are both Americans, and he would often get in his car and have to drive for like half a day or a day to be able to go train for a few hours and come back. And for me, most of my Iaido lessons haven't been, 3 times a week. It's been go once a month, train, come back, train diligently. So you're in good company. All the people on this call can really respect what it is you had to do to become a 3rd Dan in that system. A couple of other things I want to say about Professor Chet is he's friends with T. Kent Nelson, who we all love that guy. I love that guy. He's an awesome person. Student of Professor Chet. T. Kent Nelson is a student. Professor Chet's also a friend of Sensei Suino's, and obviously everybody here loves Sensei Suino deeply, and we all think he's a badass. And you can judge a lot about a person by the company that they keep and who they like. So even though I've never met you before, Professor Chet, I can tell you right now, you'd be welcome here, and I'd be happy to have dinner with you at any time, just because Kent and Sensei Suino vouch for you highly. So, and they don't vouch for people that aren't amazing. So that's my introduction today for Professor Chet.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And by the way, if you're watching in real time, remember that we want you to be part of our living history that we're creating here. So at the bottom, we have a chat button. Robbie just lit it up. So if you want to enter questions for Professor Chet, you drop them in down there. And assuming your questions aren't bullshit, we might even ask them. Also, as we always say, you're listening to 5 adults have a conversation here. And if you don't like anything you hear, Sensei Suino, this one's for you. Why don't you fuck off and find a safe space? That one's for you, Sensei Suino. I know you feel I've been going soft. And if you're watching on YouTube later, after the fact, or if you're listening on a podcast, smash that subscribe and like button. We really appreciate your support. We've been watching this thing grow, and we're super grateful you're here. So Professor Chet, how you doing tonight? Tell us a bit more about where you grew up, what it was like, and what made you grab those VHS tapes and decide to start studying.
Your question kind of cut out on me a little bit. Can you hit me with that again?
Absolutely. What was it like for you where you grew up? Tell us as much as you want about that. And then what led you to finally start training martial arts?
Yeah, so I was a farm kid. And I grew up in a time when the martial arts movies became a big thing, right? Bruce Lee had done his thing, and I remember lots and lots of ninja movies and wanted nothing more than to do that. And so I just always had loved it, but I never found anybody really to train with, and I didn't have a lot of money. I live out in a very rural place, so there just wasn't too many options. And then I watched that. It would have been UFC 2 was the first one I got to see. The very first UFC didn't get released on VHS. So I was on a waiting list to grab this thing from the video store when it came out, which incidentally was like, I watched it, would have been around this time in 1995, because I ordered the instructional tapes the first night I watched the UFC, and I had them the first week of May, because I put the tapes in and we started training.
I just had this thought, Professor Chet, that in like 100 years when none of us are here and some kid is watching this, they're going to go, what in the fuck is a VHS tape? What is he talking about?
That's great. And was that the Rorion Gracie tapes?
Yes. Yeah. And back then there was only just the basic series. So there were, it was a 5-tape series with a 6th tape that was a bonus that showed them just doing the stand-up self-defense. But the tape in the mount, tape 3 was passing the guard, tape 4 was headlock escapes, and then tape 5 was submissions. So I always make the joke, which tape do you think I put in first? And so it was submissions. Showed my cousin the Americana armbar, and the first time we're sparring, I rolled the wrong way and dislocated my elbow on the very first foray into it. So I had to back up and hit the earlier tapes and figure out.
It's funny because I actually was just about 4 days ago working on the takedown drills in that first tape, because the guy I was training with on Monday, he was talking about Rorion Gracie, who he had trained with at a seminar. And we were talking about that step in and the body wrap, and then the 3-4 ways he suggests taking down. And it was pretty funny to be working through that. And for those watching who might not know, these are up on YouTube, by the way. You can watch them. They're long, they're detailed. And also they predate the UFC, right? If I'm not wrong, he's working with a pre-UFC hoist in these. And it goes back to a bit of what you were talking about, which is how much sorry, we've got a slight delay. So if it ever seems like I'm cutting you off, just know that I might not be getting your answer. No disrespect if that happens. But it's pretty interesting how many clubs won't start from that stand-up takedown vibe, just because of either space or starting on your knees all the time. So that's something you were doing right out of the gate, right?
Yeah. But when we're training, when we're sparring, we do mostly spar from the knees.
Okay.
a beginning position, but that's mostly just safety and space constraints.
Sure.
Once you put 2 guys standing, you can only have a few guys on a mat, where
Yep.
if we're on our knees, we can have 30 people on the mat. So,
Sure.
but definitely if guys are getting ready to compete, we definitely add a lot more of the starting from the feet, for sure.
So it's the mid 90s. You're spraining your elbow, trying to figure out how to do this thing called Jiu-Jitsu, which is, not in a lot of those movies you're watching. It sounds like we grew up in a similar era. Like, I love that you mentioned ninjas, because that's such an 80s thing. Like, ninjas just
Yep.
had this total resurgence in the 80s. And so you're training this stuff. At what point do you go, I'm at a bit of a limit with these tapes? How do I actually find the guys on the tape? Like, that's such a big leap.
Well, it was kind of funny because I don't know the way I interpreted it, but so when I ordered the tapes, right, I was on a mailing list, but I've been training. So I got the tapes in May, and there was a seminar in Columbus, Ohio, at Jeff Hudson's place in July of that same year. And I get this card inviting me to this seminar, and I'm thinking, wow, Hoist has invited me to come train with him. Oh, but it was a half hour before it dawned on me that, no, you're on a mailing list, bro. Come on, you bought the tape. So, but yeah, so I got an early introduction to Hoist at that first seminar. And it was a very interesting experience. I'd never met someone that had a presence like Hoist. He was just had that presence, a very strong, very willful, powerful presence. And but I remember I didn't know anything, and when I went to the seminar, there was a bunch of traditional martial artists from other styles, and they were wearing their belts. So I was like one of the few actual white belts, and I'm just sitting around all these high-ranking black and brown belts of other arts and not knowing anything about anybody. And Hoist comes out and he starts teaching. He's just teaching what was on the tapes. And right away, a couple guys next to me are having trouble doing it. And I just helped them out real quick. And I go back to my training. And before I knew it, there was like a group around me that I was helping all these people. And then Hoist had me out in the middle and was demonstrating moves with me. And we hit it off right away. And I played a really good bad guy. So I got to get used a lot, which I loved.
So Sensei Suino, I want to pop up to you for a sec, because when he mentioned Hoist being a certain type of presence, I mean, you've trained with some of the most badass people in Japan and at the Kodokan, but you're nodding along like, yeah. So
Well,
what, I know you've had a similar experience, at least as far as meeting him. And
yeah, I was lucky enough to go to a seminar in Canada where Hoist was teaching, and so I have 3 hours. I'm very experienced. I have 3 hours of training with Royce Gracie, but absolute gentleman. I know exactly what you mean by presence, right? Like very charismatic, an absolute gentleman, really methodical instructor. And we had a laugh, right? Because there were a ton of people there from different schools, and he was going around helping people. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and he goes, "How long have you been doing BJJ?" And I go, "I don't really do BJJ." And he goes, "Oh, what do you do?" I go, "Judo." "How long have you been doing judo?" I said, "About 50 years. And we both just cracked up. And then he moved on. But it's just a funny moment, right? Because I don't think that was the answer he expected. Class individual, absolutely amazing. I really enjoyed the time I spent with him.
You got your blue belt, right, Sensei Suino?
Yeah, he gave me a blue belt.
so Professor Chet, didn't the same thing happen to you at the end of that first week? At the end of the 4 days, am I wrong?
To my first trip to the academy. Yeah, but I trained with Hoist. So when he did those seminars, it was like a weekend deal. So it was like a Saturday, Sunday. So you get like 8 to 10 hours of training with him. And I probably did 5 or 6 of those and was still a white belt. And I was like, well, what do you got to do to test for a blue belt? And I just asked him. And at that time you had to go to Torrance to their school and test. And after I asked that, it was just coincidental, I think, but Rorion put on the first ever camp. So it was 30 hours with, at that time, he was just a master, but 30 hours with Rorion. So it was 6 hours a day and for $500. And I had $2,000 saved up, and I was like, well, I don't know if it'll get me there, but it's got to get me close.
Nice.
So I jumped on that, and yeah, I got my blue belt at the first week of training out there, which would have been July of '96. So I was about a year and a few months in.
That's amazing. So I just want to break something open for people listening. When you're in between these sessions and these seminars, what does your training look like? So you're a white belt, you've got VHS tapes, and you're doing these seminars, but what are you doing at home? How many days, how many hours a day? What does that look like?
So when I first started, we were doing 3 days a week. I didn't have any money for a mat, so we took foam core that's wrapped around houses that's behind the siding. It's like 1/4-inch thick foam. But if you bundle it up in stacks and then gray tape it all together, you can make a mat out of it. So I made an 8x8 mat out of foam core. And so we get that out, put it in my dad's garage, and my cousin and my best friend, and we would just beat the crap out of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody liked the rolling part, the sparring, the trying to make each other tap, but nobody liked doing the techniques. So I went through the tapes and I wrote down every variation that I saw, and I put it on a graph paper. And I just made a deal with them that we had to do at least 5 or 6 variations, practice the technique with no resistance, just so I could do the movement, and then we could roll and have fun. And we just started going through that. And because only those tapes were out, it was easy for me to get lots and lots of reps on that. And I really believe that was one of the keys to my success, was that I hit the basics so much, because it was the only thing I had to do. And I didn't want to study anybody else's tapes at the time. So I just focused on that stuff, and lots and lots of reps. But
That's incredible. And also, Hanshi Legacy, when you first started, you had a lot of free time where you just filled it by trying out everything you learned, right? Like, am I right about that? You just spend time in the dojo just going, I'm going to try it like this, like that, like playing with what you learned?
I I don't quite know where you're getting at, but when I first started karate, I wasn't working at all. I was sort of on a sabbatical there. So I just went in, like, my sensei sort of took a liking to me, I guess, and he sort of hired me to take care of the dojo. So I'd come in the morning and clean up from the night before, and that would be at 9 o'clock. And then from 10 until about 9 o'clock that night, I was in the dojo every day except Sunday. So yeah, I just did stuff on my own, and I would do all the basics very, very slow. Then I'd do them fast, and I'd hit the bag and stuff like that. I'm sort of just taken aback by all the groundwork and stuff, because I had never delved in that at all. So I don't have too much to say about it all.
Well, that is actually what I was getting at, Hanshi. Like when he's talking about as a white belt training 3 days a week minimum, that's right at the beginning, and you're in there training 12 hours a day. Like I'm almost throwing that out to our audience. Like, it's never too soon to start training a lot of hours of this thing. Sensei Dove?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I can tell you, Sensei Legacy once hit me with a spinning wheel kick, which is not a normal combative technique that people would think. But I'm going to tell you, it was like fast. Like when he stepped down and looked at me, he said, "Are you okay?" Because he felt his foot like hit me just across the tip of my chin. And I'll tell anybody that wants to know about the way Sensei Legacy threw that wheel kick, that when he was a white belt, when he started, he'd do wheel kicks for like 45 minutes every day. He'd just go and stand in front of the mirror and just do wheel kicks for 45 minutes. Just wheel kick after wheel kick after wheel kick. When you do stuff like that, like what Professor Chet's talking about, then it just becomes part of you really fast, right? Those basics just become part of who you are. Your body and your mind just move that way easily, like walking. Nobody thinks about walking. They just walk.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. That really is what I was trying to crack open a bit, and what I get excited about. And just for people listening, like, again, if you don't know, like, Royce Gracie won the first UFC and a few after, and I just love the idea that here you are as a white belt. you think you're invited to a seminar, you finally realize, oh, right. But fundamentally, your first instructor is he's in the conversation for best of all time, best of the best, if you wanted to bother having that conversation. Like you're just showing up, getting your first and primary instruction for like up until black belt from one of the goats. Did you know that at the time? You'd seen the UFC by then. Did it take you a sec to be able to just listen, or did you have some hero worship? How was that in that 90s era before they were the legends they've become?
Well, he was already a legend to me because he'd already won 3 or 4 UFCs. So yeah. And yeah, it was weird the way it all worked out, but very blessed to all the people I've got to work with, right? I had an opportunity to train with all of Elio's sons and then several of his grandsons. So yeah, I've been very fortunate. Like even when Grand Master Helio would visit America, I would make sure that I would schedule a training session so I could be out for that week. And that way I could spend time with him as well.
What can you tell us about him? I mean, that's as foundational as it gets.
Yeah, he was, of course, he didn't speak English. So a lot of what I got from him was translated through Rorion Royce. But man, like one of the hardest workers. His work ethic was just monumental. And because of that hard work ethic, and he believed that there couldn't be a bad student, there could only be bad instructors. And it was up to the instructor to find a way to get through to the student, and no matter what it took. And if the student wasn't getting it, you weren't working hard enough. So, but yeah, he was a really cool guy.
And as someone who would
say that at the last grading we had, since like he said to the Udancha, when some of the students didn't do good, he said, the students are all fine. It's you, the teachers. You guys are not doing a good enough job.
I was just going to say, no, not at all. That's awesome. The idea, for those again who don't know, Helio is one of the founders of modern day Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you can break this open a little, but he was a little smaller while his brothers were larger, right? So he had to focus a little more on leverage and the very techniques that you ended up sort of mastering at a young age.
Yeah.
Early in the path.
I don't know that he was that much smaller than his brothers, but he would, like if he'd go up a flight of stairs, he would pass out. He'd faint.
Right.
And I don't remember what they called it. And eventually Carlos figured it out with their diet, that he was able to correct that with the diet. And then of course, I believe in the practice of jiu-jitsu, because it teaches you so much about your own body. And when you want to be on the mat, you find ways to be on the mat, you eat healthier, you do all these things to facilitate that. So I think he was just very driven towards jiu-jitsu and got through that.
Yeah, right on. So talk to us a little bit about that next part of your journey. So you made connection, you've got this blue belt, you've been going to Torrance now. What does that next phase look like for you as you basically are now making this your habit, and you're traveling all the time? And what does it look like back home? At what point did you just go, yeah, I'm doing this for real, as opposed to as a hobby, or had that already happened?
I think I made that determination after the first seminar with Royce.
Right.
Like I say, I was teaching black belts things about what was very simple to me because it was on the tapes, and I don't know, I just felt like it was my calling right away. And then after meeting Rorion, and like Royce has a strong presence, Rorion really had a very commanding presence. So yeah, meeting those guys, I was like, no, I got to do this. This is the path. Like even when Royce left the academy, he asked me to go with him and to be in his group, and it was a really tough call, but it was like I was so close to being an instructor. I didn't want to, and at that time, Grand Master Helio had only given Rorion the ability to make instructors under his name. So I wanted to have that that diploma from with Ilio's name on it. So I stayed with Rorion and
Yep. There's, I mean, you don't need to speak about this if you don't want to, but as I understand it, especially around that time in the 90s, there was a lot of politics among the Gracie family members. Is that right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
A family of fighters, there's always politics.
Yeah. Hickson talks a lot about it in terms of why he didn't fight in the UFC with Rorion, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, by the time I made it out there, so my first trip to the academy was in 96. I kind of missed that whole first batch of guys, as well as Richard Bressler, who was Horion's first student. And he just did a really good book. It's called Worth Defending. Very, very intriguing, because he was kind of the backbone behind getting Horton all the challenge matches with everybody at the time, and kind of instigating stuff. So it's a very interesting book if you ever get a chance.
So were those still happening in the 90s? Because again, for people watching, I mean, you can go look on YouTube. There's really famous challenge matches in the garage, the Gracie garage, going back into the 80s and early 90s, which is the fundamental setup for the UFC. Were those still going on by the time you got there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So talk to us about what a challenge match would look like, and if you have any interesting or fun stories about that.
Actually a bunch, but they were always great because somebody would come in and want a challenge. And like, I don't know, the times I was there when it happened, it was like everybody wanted to be the one that got to do them, to take the challenge.
Right.
It's like, I got it. So that was really cool. But I got lucky because being from the Midwest and nobody being around here that did jiu-jitsu, and we were, you know, a lot of farm people and wrestlers and stuff. I got to do quite a few. Once they learned, you know, you're a blue belt under the Gracies. And back then that blue belt had this lore to it, like it was a mythical beast or something, but would get lots of guys coming, which was awesome.
So you back home did a lot of your own challenge matches.
Yeah.
How'd that feel? I mean, this is something that doesn't quite happen today, where, you know, you just open up and you go, if anybody thinks they can take me, come take me. Like, that's intense.
Yeah. I don't know if it ever was kind of like that, but, and there were some instances where you had a weird one come up, but it was usually just, you'd be talking to somebody and they'd be like, well, does that really work? And yeah. And next thing you know, you'd be trying something, and then they'd try a little harder, and then you go ahead and go. And then there was a local bar that I would get to go to. They would once a month put a boxing ring up in the middle of this bar, and guys could either box or fight or kickbox or grapple. So I would go up and do grappling matches up there, and the guy would just always get me matches if I'd show up. So I'd teach class Friday night and then run up there and do a grappling match in front of a bunch of drunk people, which was always hilarious.
Anybody ever give you a real good run, like some cornbread wrestler who just had fucking moves, or did the jits always just kind of quietly prevail?
I had one guy that went to a draw with me, and it was just a match. He was getting ready to fight in MMA, and he didn't want to stay connected. So as soon as we get to the ground, he would work to get back up. And whether I threw him or he threw, it didn't matter. He just kept breaking away and getting up. So after 18 minutes, I kind of got bored of it, and the crowd was really bored of it because they were drinking and wanting to see some action. So
sure.
But it was a weird, right? It was like he was running the whole time. So it really wasn't that anything to that. But when the guys came more to try to tap me, that's where the jiu-jitsu seemed to just prevail amazingly. And they just always fell into the traps. And it's one of those things that I always like to clarify. I don't ever think it was me. I mean, I repped the moves. I knew the movements. I trusted the movements, but it was just the techniques, the way the leverage was set, the way we transitioned to different things. It was just so efficient and so, I don't know, perfect, because I could make great mistakes and be able to adapt and recover.
Well, I love that. I just wrote that down. It wasn't me. I just repped the moves. I saw Sensei Suino nod along on that. Sensei Dauphin, you wanted to chip in an idea about the challenge idea, or?
Yeah, I did, but I also just want to say to Professor Chet, as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking the exact opposite. I was thinking, this guy's a tough guy who trains super hard, who had the nutsack to get in the ring and take on challenges. So it had to be somewhat about you as well, Professor Chet. Like, it's nice that you're being humble and saying it's, but I know lots of people who do karate, BJJ, lots of things who wouldn't take those challenges. And I guess what I wanted to say is, when you were talking about it, I've seen Hachi Legacy do so many demos. I've been Izuke so many times, and he always would say to the crowd, if you don't think I can do the things I say I'm doing, you can come on out here and I'll do it to you. And I've actually been lucky enough to be there when a couple of people were stupid enough to take their shoes and their socks off and come out. Like, I saw a Western Mustang football player say, I don't think you can stop me from tackling you. And he said, okay, go ahead and tackle me. And the next thing I knew, he had hooked under his armpit and pushed his head down and launched him. And because you're at the University of Western Ontario, the guy smashed into a bunch of desks and they all like fell on top of him. And I think like a showdown, and I'm like, this is awesome. Like, I'm loving this. And another time, this giant guy with like these muscles said, I don't think you can get out of my bear hug. And he says, well, you come up here and throw me in a bear hug. And, you got to realize that the other black belts, I'm sure it's the same way in the Gracie family. And everybody's keenly watching to make sure that this is going in the direction that we want it to go. Like, you're not going to win this situation, but we didn't need to watch. He could have been alone, because this guy throws that Legacy in a bear hug, and he just kind of smiles at the like 65 people staring at him, and slides his hand behind and grabs a hold of this guy by the nutsack. And then you see the guy's face, like his eyes get like that big, and he makes a sound like, whoo. And then you'd think a normal person would just let him go, but since the Legacy doesn't, he just holds on to him for a little longer, right? So again, I can relate to what you're saying about just taking the challenges on, because I've seen it happen. That's what I wanted to chime in, Sean.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sensei. Sensei Suino, what about you? Like, not necessarily do you have any old war stories about that, but how important is it for martial artists standing up there to go, I'll take you on, or not?
I think it depends on the person and the atmosphere, but you got to nut up. You got to nut up in martial arts if you stay in it long enough, right? Unless you're just dancing, that means stepping on the floor of the Kodokan, and and there's 200 Japanese people there that want to fight you, or whatever it might be. You just gotta, sometimes you gotta nut up, and I'm not a guy with a long list of competitive wins in the combatives, so I'm pretty humble about that. But I just think in martial arts it's got to be more than just dancing.
Right. Yep. I mean, I don't have that long list either. I think so much of it's about knowing ourselves, like knowing what situations that might not go my way, and it's going, okay, this isn't the time. So Professor Chet, we got a question come in, and I think it's a good time for it, because it's that period where you're seeing your teachers intermittently. And this is a question from Justin Shea, one of our black belts. Hey, Justin, how's it going? He asked, since you had limited time training with the Gracies early in your training, what was your mindset when you did train with them? Was there anything in particular you were focused on? Great question.
Every movement they made. One of the things that always fascinated me was when they would demonstrate a technique, how they could make it look so effortless, so smooth, so efficient. Yeah, no wasted movement. So I would watch that, and then when I go home, when I'm training with my training partners, I found out very quickly that the more I showed them, the more I benefited. Because as their skill level rose, mine had to raise. So it's that philosophy that a tide raises all boats. So I have a very amazing culture in my schools, both schools, and it's such a blessing is that everybody knows that if we make the weakest person better, everybody got better. So it's a very helpful environment, and it just becomes this give and take thing, and everybody does it. It's just amazing.
That's,
think I got,
pardon me?
I think I got off topic on the question, but
Well, no, you nailed it right out of the gate. He just asked what you particularly focused on. And the reason I love the question is because sometimes when you have limited time, you're like, I need to get everything I can. And it can maybe even interfere with getting what you could get in a short period of time.
yeah, it's just weird though. It's like the more you help, the more you get. So as my training partners got better, that elevated me to be better. So then when I'd make those week trips out to the academy, I had to beat the higher ranked guys if they were ever going to consider me for promotion. So it was always this, it felt like always a test whenever I went out of how I executed. So then when I came home, it was like, I guess that was my purpose, right? Is that my next trip, when I went out in 3 months, I wanted to do better. I wanted to be more technical. And if they commented on anything I was doing wrong, or they felt like I was inefficient with, I always wanted to make sure I addressed that with a lot of reps. And I always had the belief that if I did something wrong once, I needed a minimum of 5 techniques correctly done.
Right.
So, right, you do a motion, you realize you did a little bit wrong. So then I want to do like 5 and make sure I do those 5 right to try to reprogram that negative. And
Yeah,
sometimes that.
Sorry, you're giving yourself a consequence too, right? Your consequence is I did it wrong and I'm going to make myself pay for doing it wrong.
Yeah, but because I didn't have the black belt instructor, Royce or Rorion, or even Grand Master Helio looking over me to make those corrections, it kind of had to be that way, where we just accepted that we were going to have to work harder because it was going to take us a little bit longer. And if we made mistakes, then we had to do correction training to get out the bad habits. Almost more like unlearning than learning.
So I see Sensei Suino nodding a lot to this, and I actually want to throw it to you, Sensei Suino, because not only are you really agreeing with this idea, but you have a student, Randy Dauphin, Sensei Dauphin, right below you on my screen, who would go train with you and then not see you maybe for 3 months. And I know he's training those 1, 2, or 3 notes max. So how important is it actually sometimes to have that time away from your teacher with just 1 or 2 notes versus getting new information every class?
Yeah, that's a great concept, right? There's a balance there. I think whatever information you get, you got to train like it's vital, right? And if that's just the 3 things, you train your ass off on those 3 things. Or if you're lucky enough to go and spend 3 hours with a sensei once a week, then you might have 15 things, right? You better train those 15. Better be willing to put the time in, right? So yeah, I think it's important. I love, Professor Chet, what you said. I say this probably 3 times a week in my dojo. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? It's so important, in judo, my black belts, they have to come to the basic class and help for an hour and 15 minutes and train with everybody to earn the right to come to the advanced class. And guess what? Shocking. Everybody gets better. Like, the funny thing is I think you pointed out, the white belts get better, but the black belts get better too, right? Because they're involved in that process.
Yep.
So great.
So yeah, Hanshi, I want to throw it to you and then back to you, Sensei Dauphin, for the same question. You had time where you would train with your teacher in Toronto, let's say, and then you had all this time without him. Arguably, your martial arts deepened through your self-guided learning. Is that a really important part, or are we in an era where it's better, like, just see your teacher every day if you can?
Well, I would have to say, in my art, like, you have basics, and you do basics in order to get better. You do new techniques in order to learn more. So if you want to get better, you always do your basics. Stress your basics, stress those. In Jiu-Jitsu, I'm not sure what they would be, but I'm sure that there's a certain set of techniques or whatever that you just do those over and over, and it's going to make you stronger, better, wiser, as opposed to doing a lot more different ones. And that, again, just makes you know more, but it doesn't actually make you better. That's my take on that.
Thanks, Hanshi. Sensei Dauphin, time with a single note versus going to get a new note.
Yeah. So one of the things Professor Chet said, the question was asked, like, what did you focus on when you went there? And he said, everything, every single move, and I like to say I wasn't really good at anything in the beginning except for being a good student, which I think that's what it is. Professor Chet just nailed it, right? You pay 100% attention to your teacher. You focus on every single thing. I've said it on this podcast before, and you've heard me say it, Benson. If Sensei Legacy was leaving the dojo and he dropped his keys one time on the way out, I dropped my keys 3 times just to be sure, like my car keys 3 times just to be sure that I was doing what he did before I left the dojo. On your question about the notes, I'm not sure. Like, I think in the beginning, maybe, like, this is just a theory. I could be wrong about this. In the beginning, there's probably a lot of benefit to having like ready access to your sensei so you can learn the basics of EI, BJJ, karate, judo, whatever it might be. But after that, I think it's kind of up to you. Professor Chet's even talked about that too. Like, it was up to him. Like, he had the tapes, he had the basics, he practiced the basics. It was up to him, did the basics, went and got things. I guess one of the things that I would say to students is if you're training at a distance, one of the things you should hope for is that I'm really happy that when I go train with Sensei Suino, if not usually, I mean, the pandemic was a time where 2 years went by, but other than that, it was usually a month. I kind of had this goal that I'm going to Michigan once a month or at least every other month. Not too often that I get the same correction after 2 months. He'd give me a correction and say, grip the sword like this, pull your shoulders back here. And then I would go back and train for 2 months. And when I came back, if I started doing stuff and he didn't say, pull your shoulders back, I was like, yeah, like my last 2 months was like successful because I didn't get the same correction again. So
Right. I really appreciate listening to that. I love thinking about it because obviously I've trained away from my teachers a lot. So Professor Chet, I want to jump into that blue belt, moving to purple belt. And it sounds like you started competing a bit more. Can you talk about that, the importance of competing in jiu-jitsu? And also, was that fundamental to you moving forward as you started to get your subsequent purple and brown belts?
Well, I think it was for me because I was a long range student and nobody had ever done that before. So I always felt like where their students would have to beat one guy to rank, I always felt like I had to beat 6. And maybe that wasn't true, but that's what it always felt like. So the reason I would go to tournaments was just for a chance to submit everybody I could put my hands on and prove, that I was ready for something else.
I love that. I'm sorry. I just like that. I wanted to submit everybody I could get my hands on.
And I mean, we do our homework and stuff, and it talks here about how you actually, you lost a tournament the day you did move up to your purple belt. And what is that like for you? Like you prepare, you do the work, you don't win, but at the same time you're getting graded. And what's the significance of competing and losing, and also the feeling of then grading around the same time?
I think, failure is one of those interesting things where how you deal with it kind of makes it what it is. And that kind of sounds awful, but like when you have a failure, if you can use that to motivate yourself, and things have to be balanced, you can always do things unhealthy, get too into things, but like I just always try to use my failures as I'm going to do better tomorrow. I'm going to try not to let that happen again. And even though a lot of times it would, I would just, I'm just going to get better from it. You can't, because there's always going to be failures. And especially if I always go back to self-defense. I always imagine if I get in a street fight, I'm having a horrible day because for some reason my verbal jiu-jitsu didn't get me out of trouble, or my awareness, my situational awareness wasn't on point to see the attack coming. And so I always imagine that I'm having a horrible day. So I expect there to be a lot of bad things happening, mistakes, and always needing to adapt. And that was just something I got lucky with in all the challenge matches and little things I did. I made mistakes, but I was able to adapt and just always seemed to find a way. And I think it's based on how you look at your failures, right? Your failure can be a horrible loss, or it can be a great opportunity. You know, how else are you going to know what the chinks in your armor are if you don't get something pointed out? Like
Amen.
mine was, I pushed up for arm bars a lot.
We have this in common, by the way. I competed in a tournament in December, and I was so prepared for it. I was going to win. I pulled a bonehead move when I was ahead to try and go for an ankle lock. The guy slid over my knee, took me out, got the points. But COVID delayed the actual ceremony, but I got my purple belt that day. And it was, yeah, thanks. And my coach was like, man, what are you doing? You pulled now, brother. Like, you had that fight. But the week after, I went back and I locked in like 10 ankle locks because I technically realized where my knee had slipped, and I made sure that wasn't going to happen again. So I really hear you on that. And I love that we share that with each other. And thanks for the congrats. So we have our 10 questions, but I want to ask you one question before that. Just talk us through that next 3 years to your brown belt, and also about the length of time these jiu-jitsu belts take. Here you are training your ass off, you're training with the best in the world, but your belts are taking, 1.5 to 3 years from purple to brown. Can you talk about that period for you, but also how JIT grades those belts a little differently? Because some of our listeners won't totally get why a belt takes 3 years.
Yeah, and actually that was a weird one for me. My purple to brown was really quick. I think so. I got my purple belt in 2000, and in 2003 I got my brown belt. So that was my fastest belt. The rest of them were 4 to 5 years for blue. I think it was 5 years for blue, and 4, because it was 12 and a half till I got my black belt. But again, because I trained a long ways away, that was just something Rorion said to me right off the bat was, I can't watch you every day. So just expect this to take longer. And I had really immersed myself in the instructor program. So I cared about my rank, but I was more concerned with, I wanted to be an instructor. I wanted to be a certified instructor. So I got my assistant instructor in 2001. And then I was promoted to full instructor in 2003 when I got my black belt. So,
and then were you getting any stripes? Was that part of your deal at all, or was that just kind of like happening for you?
So it was weird. I competed in my first tournament at a purple belt, and like you mentioned, I lost when I got my purple belt. I'd lost that blue belt match. It was to a real good guy, Kenny Bond. But then in my first tournament as a purple belt, I submitted everybody in my weight class in the open division. So I think they gave me 2 stripes after that. And then the following tournament was the Trip of a Lifetime tournament, which was the Trip of a Lifetime was if you won your weight division, you got to fight in a super fight. And the winner of that super fight would get a ticket to go to Brazil and stay at Helio's ranch with him for 9 days. So luckily I submitted everybody in that one too.
Yeah, luckily. Yeah.
Before
that was just, yeah.
Before we get too far away, I want to hear more about that. But what were the tournaments like, Professor Chet, that you were in? Were these local tournaments, and who were the people? Like, can you give a little background? I know you've been around a lot of police officers and wrestlers. Can you just kind of talk about the culture of those years when you were competing in purple and brown ranks?
I was mostly traveling out and competing in California with those guys. I did a few local ones, like the state tournament. There was some stuff. So I had some good matches with like James Klingerman. In fact, he caught me in a triangle choke when I was a purple belt. Really good one. Never forget that. But so we go back and forth trading matches, but most of my competition was out in California because I wanted to do it in front of Grand Master Helio, because he'd always oversee the tournament. And they also had the most favorable rules for me. So I was more slow, grindy. I wanted to wear you down, and then I would beat you with technique instead of athleticism. Where in these local tournaments, there was a time limit. In the Gracie tournament, it was a no time limit for me, or I had a half hour. So I just had time to wear these better athletes out.
And were
Because
those
as I got
sub
to the
only?
higher rank, I'm sorry.
Were those sub only, submission only?
They had so when they first started it was no time limit, but if you got to 15 points, whoever got to 15, if there wasn't a submission, would be the winner.
Right.
But submission would always end it. So
yeah.
But usually you'd hit the points, and then they switched to a half hour, and I believe it was 12 points was the automatic win. So, but I think they just started doing that to try to speed the tournaments up, because we fight for a while.
You know what I like, Professor Chet, is you're proving a point that I've said in the past, which is you remember everybody who beat you, but not necessarily everybody that you beat. You're mentioning all these people. You're like, this person choked me out and this person caught me in an arm bar, and you remember all that shit, but you probably can't name every person that you beat. Some of them are right. Like, you remember everybody who beat you, but you don't remember everybody that you beat.
Because that's who you learn from, right? They showed me my chink in my armor. They made me stronger.
Love that. So we're going to jump to our 10 questions here, and then we're going to come back and talk about your time at the ranch as you move toward your brown belt. These are our 10 questions that we ask all our guests. We ask that you answer as impulsively as possible, and then break open your answer if you like or not. It's up to you. You ready for your 10 questions?
Okay.
What is the most effective move in your martial arts arsenal?
Patience.
Who is the most influential martial artist in your life?
Helio Gracie.
Who do you believe to be the most influential martial artist of all time, and why?
Rorion Gracie. And just for what he established, the foundation he laid. I mean, you could always argue that it was Royce because he was the one that performed in the show. But I think Rorion picking Royce instead of Rickson was a very strategic thing. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rickson, but when he was fighting, he had 20 pounds more muscle than any of his brothers. He was very powerful. He could strike, was pretty good. And, Royce being smaller and thinner, I think he presented more what was a sales pitch for Rorion and Jiu-Jitsu was that the average person could enhance themselves. So.
Right on. What excites you most about the next 5 years of your training?
Just finding smaller details so I can do more with less.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you get there?
Welcome.
That's what Sense of Legacy said.
I'm sure he'd say that for me, but
do you have a favorite film and television martial artist?
Oh, you probably have to go with Chuck Norris. I mean, Bruce Lee, freaking amazing. And there's been so many good ones, but I don't know. Chuck just kind of had the way with TV and movies.
Yeah, he sure did. Is there a martial artist, living or dead, in all of recorded history that you would like to train with the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know there is, but all I can go back to is who I've got to train with, which I just feel so blessed on that, which was Helio and his brothers. I suppose like maybe Henzo, Marcelo Garcia, some of those guys for sure.
Right on. You have that in common with a lot of us. Like, Sure, there's mythical and awesome, but we kind of love training with the people we know and have trained with. We just don't feel like there's enough time in this world to train with them. So, and the last two questions. Oh, no, pardon me. If everyone in the world could have the greatest benefit you've gotten from martial arts, whether they train or not, what gift would they be getting?
Awareness of health, I think. Awareness of health. The more I train, the more my diet and things that I do, and keeping myself healthy and knowing when to take breaks. And I've trained basically 6 days a week for most of my career. And when I first started, I was working a construction job as well as training. So, when you're young, it's easier to do. And as you get older, you gotta really find your rest areas.
Yeah. Our last two questions come as a pair. What is your greatest achievement and your greatest regret?
I suppose that's a tricky question, right? Because my ego would say my greatest achievement was maybe winning the tournament to go stay with Helio for a week. But yet I don't think that's my greatest achievement. I think my greatest achievement was a shy person that I helped give a little more confidence to, or a woman that was able to stand up for herself and create a boundary, or a child that could talk to his bully.
Regret?
All the people I've hurt. And too many stories of that, just not realizing how much leverage was in some of the techniques. And, and when there's an injury, it's usually the other person should have gave up sooner, right? We have the ability to tap, but, like one I remember that was just horrible for me was I was at a seminar in Cleveland. And this is probably my 4th or 5th seminar with Royce. So I'm really wanting him to give me a blue belt. And he pairs us up to start sparring, and I'm sparring with this. He was a really nice police officer, but he was just a monster of a man. I mean, just all muscle. I could barely get my hand to go around his bicep. He was so big. And of course, that's who I would definitely wanted to work with and spar when Royce was going to be watching. That's what we do. So, but when I was rolling with him, I caught him in an arm lock. And I see Royce walking up, and he was so powerful, he was curling me up out of the arm lock. And normally I would let go, but with Royce walking up, I levered into it, and then his bicep detached and shot up into his shoulder. So I just horrible. I felt like this tall because, not only did I not get a blue belt for hurting this guy, it was just awful. I never saw the guy again. But of course, it was Cleveland, so it was 3 or 4 hours from my home. But
Right.
It's just too many times in my career where we'd be silly and accidentally injure somebody.
Well, it sounds like a really legit regret, but I think you should have tapped. Thanks for those 10 questions. I know we want to get back to your time at the ranch, but we got a question from Dan Holland, who's one of Sensei Suino's students and black belts, and who I had the pleasure of rolling with and getting submitted by when he was just up here. And his question is, what are your thoughts on protecting yourself from dirty fighting? People who bite, scratch, grab hairs, ears, etc. Of course, that's a huge problem in any self-defense, but especially hard to manage in close quarters grappling like judo and BJJ.
Yeah, before you answer, it's because I'm going to bite, scratch, and pinch Dan Holland every time I grapple with him. I'm going to bite him every chance I can get because he's so much better than me.
So I apologize, Sean, you cut out right at the beginning of your question.
Oh, okay. I'll read it again. What are your thoughts on protecting yourself from dirty fighting? People who bite, scratch, grab hair, ear. Obviously, that's a problem in any self-defense, but anything close quarters like grappling, it's going to be a real problem. Where do you go with that?
So in that realm, my biggest concern is always the eye gouge. Everything else that's dirty tactics is a pain compliance. Like I had a really nice guy, he's a private student of mine. I think he was a 6th Dan in a form of Taekwondo, whatever. But he goes, I got this idea. I got this great idea to get you off a mount. And he inserted his knuckle in between a rib, rotated, right? Does a little rib separation, very painful technique, but it didn't roll me. So then my question to him was, right, now that it didn't succeed and you've angered me, right, it just sends this really, really strong. So biting, groin strikes, scratching, grabbing fingers, I don't feel like those are fight ending things unless the person's weak. But if you give someone good reason to be there, like they're defending a family member, something like that, I don't think those techniques are going to stop anybody, and it usually escalates the violence. But I'm very concerned with eye gouging. I remember I was fighting once, and he didn't poke me in the eye, but his knuckle hit my eyeball when we were fighting. One of the shots hit me, and it made both my eyes water shut. You know, so there was a good 30, 40 seconds where I couldn't see anything. Luckily, I got a hold of him and we were grappling, but I'm always worried about eye gouges, which is probably why Americana is one of my favorite techniques. It's a great counter to somebody going for your eyes.
So is there any way, like, let's say, you know, you and I are grappling, you don't know me, that you can set up to avoid that once we start getting close to each other?
I think just my standard base where I'm at, and then I watch, right? I don't think you can do things without kind of giving away some intent, what you're going for. So because I expect it, I'm watching it. It's kind of corny, but if you guys remember in Roadhouse, the little scene where the guy walks in with the little knife sticking out of his boot, right? And Patrick Swayze was like, you know, you just got to know what you're looking for. If you see it, then you can deal with it. If you don't know it's there, it's going to be a problem. So I always expect dirty fighting.
Yep. I don't think you're going to find anyone on this call thinking Roadhouse is cheesy. Love that movie. Love that movie. You know, I'm glad you said that about the groin. I mean, I don't know what your experience is grappling, but I haven't been doing it that long, and I've probably been kneed hard in the nuts 100 times. And it's weirdly like, you just keep rolling. Like, it doesn't end the thing.
Yeah, but it's not weird, Sean. You give the groin to everybody. Like, here it is.
I lean with the groin. No, but would you agree with that, Professor Chet? Like, you can take a weirdly large strike there, and
I think there's always the potential that it can incapacitate you, but
right.
it takes such a perfect shot.
I think that's, yeah.
And usually when we're that close, it's just not a good angle to find it. Like if I mount it on someone, that's a hard angle to get. Yep. Where I've had it the worst is trying to pass someone's guard and I accidentally fall on their knee or something. Then those can be quite excruciating.
Yep. So, you know, you even said he was the most influential in your life. And also, oh, pardon me. Let me shoot that to Sensei Suino right now.
Well, I guess this is sort of a related question, but not really. Professor Chet, I know you're around police officers. You train with them and you know them. I think some came to the last seminar up in Lansing that I went to. Some of my police friends have said to me now that there's a much bigger imperative for them to start doing more BJJ, staying in better shape. Even some guys that were, you know, collegiate wrestlers and things before they were police officers, they're encountering a lot more people that are trained in grappling than they did 10 years ago. Are you hearing the same kind of stuff?
Yeah, a little bit, but I think there's just this, you know, with all the events that we had in 2020, and I think there's just this push where people are starting to realize that the police force isn't trained like we think they are. I feel like most people expect our police force to operate like a SEAL Team 6 Special Forces unit who gets months and months to prepare for one little mission, right? And these guys are getting sometimes 4 hours a year, and then they break that up into shooting, talking, hands-on, whatever. But it's like 4 hours a year is a joke. So I think that's a real problem for our country. That, I mean, us as citizens, maybe of the world, I don't know, with Canada, but as citizens, I think we should expect our police force to be able to do their mantra, which is to protect and serve, is what it says on all our police cars, to protect and serve. And when you have a police officer that is fearful, I don't feel like he can protect or serve anybody's interest but his own. And that makes for, bad camera footage and stuff. So I would like to see where the departments get behind the training and help these guys, because right now, the way it is in Indiana for our guys is they got to do it on their time and their dime. There's no kickback for them, and most of them aren't allowed to do it during work hours. They have to do it after hours. And I think it comes down to work comp claims and stuff like that the administrators are afraid of. So, but even if it wasn't BJJ, I mean, you could argue, does it have to be that particular art? I don't know. I think just gentlemen figuring out how to put hands on somebody, to have some confidence in what they do, goes a long way, because when you don't have confidence, you escalate to higher degree of weapons on your tool belt. And we all know how that ends.
You said something, Professor Chet, that kind of keyed me, which is you talked about cameras and people watching and things like that. And one thing I think about is that grapplers are not easily understood by people outside of martial arts, right? Like if you're in martial arts, when somebody's working for a submission, trying to get an armbar, trying to choke somebody out, but the average person on the sidewalk doesn't. But they do understand if a police officer all of a sudden throws a hard side kick to the inside of somebody's knee and busts their knee in half, and they've got a camera on that, and then all of a sudden, that blows up, and let's defund the police and let's blah, blah, blah. I don't really have a question. I'm just sharing with you something that kind of popped into my brain as you were talking about this, specifically the camera part of it. Yeah, I think police should do BJJ and things like that. They should do things other people don't know and understand.
Yeah, but they should be given the opportunity to train more, right? This idea that they have to pay for their own training, it just seems silly to me. Like, I expect them to operate in a professional thing. It's like, get them in the dojo during the day. It should be like, yeah, you get an extra long lunch, go train for an hour, something like that.
Amen.
Yeah.
Take us back to your week, especially when we even asked about your most influential martial artist. I mean, even just the way you said Helio, like such a connection to that person in that time. You want to talk about that? Like what was that for you? And then what did that lead to afterwards?
Every time you ask a question, Sean, you keep cutting out.
Oh man, I was
sorry.
just saying, no, it's not you. It's the whole setup, and we work with it. Is the idea that Helio Gracie, Grand Master, was the most influential martial artist in your life, and then you got to go spend this week with him after literally winning it in a tournament. What was that week for you, and what did it lead to and change in your martial arts?
Well, it was amazing. So there was all these other guys that got to go with us, and it was Huron and Henner and I were the only ones that won from the academy. So all these other guys that got to go with us were like from Machado's, or see Elliot Marshall. He was from Amal, who was under Henzo. So just a really cool collection of guys. And we go down to Brazil, and of course Elio had a training room on his house, right? A mat in there. So we get there, and day one we go into the training room and we start working trap and roll. And all these guys are champions. They all won to get there, right? They're all accomplished guys. And he starts just picking apart their trap and rolls and critiquing this and critiquing that and showing them how to do it. And just, it was so phenomenal to me. Just so amazing. He would always revert back to the basics. And then, on top of that, if you think about when you watch a lot of the Gracies fight, you don't see a lot of fancy moves, flashy stuff. It's just very basic control. But when they do it, it's like nobody can stop it because they've done it so much and they're so good at it. And I feel the same way with my Americana. Americana is one of the first arm locks you get to learn when you start training jiu-jitsu. But yet it's the submission that I catch the most, and I've caught the highest ranked people with it.
Explain just real quick for everybody listening what a trap and roll is.
Trap and roll is where you're under the mount position, so the person's on top of you with their legs on both sides, and you trap an arm and a leg on the same side and lift your hip to launch them off so you can get on top of them, and it rolls them out.
Yeah, I love it. That's the first technique you learn at my club when you go for your intro, like an Oompa, so you could basically exist if you get mounted, and it's the one you're doing with the founder of the art. Do you consider him the founder of the art?
No, because he had a certificate from the Kodokan that stated that they believed Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was a separate martial art from the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. But I think he just like when you read the history on the Gracie brothers, like Carlos was the one that was training with Maeda.
Mm-hmm.
But he only trained with him for 2 years. And then these guys developed this system that eventually shakes up the whole martial arts world, 100 years later. And in my mind, at 2 years training, he couldn't have been more than a blue belt in my mind. So then how they developed that was them working with each other, basically doing what I did with my training partners. So it's always very interesting how sometimes history gets to repeat itself. And just to add to this, right, because I was able to do something like that, it doesn't mean it was easy. It doesn't mean it's the path everybody should go. You pose the question, should you train with an instructor or more training on your own? I think it's always better to have the instructor. What we have to watch for is, do our common students get lazy because they're being spoon-fed everything and they're not working as hard as the guy working on his own, who's having to put in the extra work to do it. But if you are going to do it without that instructor there all the time, it is harder. You have to put in more work. There's just no other way around that. So,
yeah.
Sorry, I guess
we talked about that during COVID, about how this is, we almost all got forced to do a bit of what you did at the beginning of your career, which is go through the bottleneck of, I can't necessarily see my teacher. I might be on a Zoom call, or, a lot of clubs even shut down. So a lot of people got orphaned and had to figure out how to keep training every day in every martial art. And I actually think it was an excellent thing for martial arts. Like it forced people to go one-on-one or smaller groups. Not necessarily in our club, that didn't happen, but I think whoever made it through tougher and with deeper ownership of their art.
Yeah, now that COVID's over, I've got all these people around me slowing me down from my own training.
Professor Chet, we could talk all night, but I want to ask one question about what you said, because I think it's significant. You said, that like shakes up the martial arts, like he trains for 2 years with Maeda, and next thing you know, you've got this thing called the UFC and you've got this thing called BJJ, and it really changed. Your story is very common that a lot of people, like Eddie Bravo talks about this really famously, like they see that first, second, that third UFC and they go, wait, I now need to go do this thing, or it is altering my journey. Why? Like, what is it about that art that was able to come in and change so many people's way of thinking until it fundamentally, even if you don't do it, you have to be able to deal with it? Like, how did it become the thing that inserted itself that way?
I don't really know. I have an opinion, and it's worth probably a grain of salt, but my opinion is because of the way we train, there is so much failure. Like you start out rolling with better guys and they're tapping you, and you're constantly being shown what your weakness is. And I don't know, to me, it just always felt very truthful. Like you can't, like somebody can pretend they're a rank. Like there was a video of a guy giving himself a brown belt, claiming, yeah, I've deserved this. I've been a purple belt for this many years and this, but I never see that guy on the mat. It's interesting with the physicality of what we do. There's always this challenge to what's being taught. And I always tell the guys, man, if you can beat me, beat me. I want to know if I'm teaching something that is not effective. I don't want to teach it because that's how I learned it. I want to teach because it's going to help you and defend yourself. So it's just this constant scientific approach, right? We're always running experiments on these movements and how they work. And do we feel like they're punch safe? Is it levered? Can I do this if I'm fatigued? Which I think that's a big one that was one of the great things that came from Grand Master Helio, was that you shouldn't train for your best day. You should train for your worst day. And what he meant by that was, don't train for the day you feel good and everything's working right. Train for the day when you have an injury or you've been sick for 3 days and you're dehydrated, and that's the day the guy jumps you. How's your techniques work then? What's in your toolbox that's going to work without your full power, right? So a classic example of this would be how I teach the rear naked choke, which is where I wrap around the neck and I put pressure, make somebody pass out. You can squeeze any way you want with any amount of strength and people will all pass out. So the strength aspect can be very effective. But if I make you do 100 push-ups and then ask you to choke someone and you were using the squeeze, right? Your choke now all of a sudden is very ineffective. Or your ability to squeeze with hard pressure lasts for such a short time, you can't make them pass out. And then I would just ask, if you're in a real fight and somebody is getting the better of you and you're on the bottom and you're defending, are you going to be using your arms to defend punches, right? And I always felt like when I fought, my arms got very fatigued. So it was always very adamant with Helio that we had to choke without strength, using our core muscles, not relying on our arm strength, because our arm strength's only there when you're having a good day and it's early. If you're tired, it's nothing worse than seeing somebody pull your hands down and get out of your choke. You're like, no.
You work so hard to get the back. Yeah,
Yes.
you can't do the one thing you're supposed to do back there. I love that. What a great answer. We do now what we call going around the horn, which is that we all share our thoughts and a vibe that we got from you. And then the last word will go to you before we do a little housekeeping about what's coming up. So Hanshi Legacy, what do you want to say about our time with Professor Chet?
Well, it was very informative for me because I've never done that art. But the one thing I will say is that I like to say this thing to certain persons, and that I'm glad to see that you're a student, because from the student, the title of student, you will gain everything that you possibly can get, instead of finding ways to go around stuff and that you attacked it right on. And that's what makes you a better person and a better martial artist. I recognize that in you. I'm sorry, but that's my extent of jiu-jitsu.
Thanks, Hanshi.
Thank you.
Sensei Suino?
This was great, Professor Chet. I know, we've been on the mat together just twice and learned a lot from you in that short period of time, but I'm just starting to scratch the surface of the history. I feel like we just barely got started. There's so much more I want to ask about your fighting career and the people you train with. But at least we cracked that window open, and it just tells me again the commonalities behind serious martial artists involved in serious martial arts. The philosophies are different in specifics, but they always seem to be the same in the general. Thanks so much for sharing that stuff.
Thanks, Sensei Suino. Sensei Dauphin?
I really agree with what Sensei Suino said. There's so many things that Professor Chet said that I've heard Sensei Suino say many times. I've heard Sensei Legacy say many times, just in different ways. And that's what a lifetime of devotion to an art and martial arts gives you. Yeah, Professor Chet, every time we do this, we've done like 60 something of them. And there's very few of the people that we've done them with that I haven't met or trained with. You're one of the few, and you're up there in the top of them that I really hope we can cross paths. Like I really, really do. I also want to say, even though it's Kent's anniversary, and happy anniversary to Kent, he did actually make it onto the call. So he has been on here listening, Professor Chet. So I just want to say that to you. I always write a bunch of notes just so I can prove to you that I have been listening to you. And one of the things that kind of occurred to me as you were talking is, like, you know, when you read a martial arts book or a philosophy book, and at the beginning of every chapter, there's a little bullet that you read, and then that kind of sets the tone for everything. And you don't really care about anything else that you read other than the little bullet that you read at the beginning of the chapter. You said so much shit, Professor Chet, that's like, if you write a book, use this as the bullet for the top of the chapter, right? So when somebody trains, it takes years to become proficient. Competition, you train for competition, not for combatives, and not for the art, not for self-defense. Concrete is unforgiving. I like that you said that, or concrete is unforgiving. Your submission tape, you went right to tape number 5, and you dislocated your elbow, and that was a self-correcting problem. You never probably ever did that ever once again after that. I really, the vibe you're giving, I can totally see you as a white belt being with a bunch of brown and black belts, having trained that and saying, you know, you're doing that wrong. You need to do this or that, because we're just talking about the color of the belts and not necessarily what the skill level is in the art, right? And your skill, regardless of the color, was higher. Really like the idea of you being a farm guy with 8x8 mats of foam core, and your training sessions were with your dad and your cousins and anybody that you could get in that you could choke out. I like that. I like what you said about Helio, no bad students, just bad instructors. You knew from your first class it was your calling. I strongly relate to that. The first time I walked into a class with Sensei Legacy, I knew that was the end. This was my life, and this is what I was going to do forever. So I like to hear that commonality. Another bullet: families of fighters always have politics. Of course they do, right? A tide raises all boats. If the weakest person gets better, everyone gets better. I have students that are new teachers, and as soon as they start teaching white belts, and then they come to the black belt class, I'm like, holy shit, your basics are way better. Like, you're doing so much better now because you're teaching beginners, right? What did you focus on in your first, when you were at a distance? Every single thing they did, exclamation mark. Everybody should listen to that. You do it wrong once, you do it correctly 5 times. That's it. Do it wrong once, do it at least 5 times correctly. I went to the tournament to submit everyone I could get my hands on. I fucking love that, right? If I have a street fight, I'm having a horrible day. You also said 12.5 years to get your black belt, but that actually wasn't your goal. You wanted to be an instructor, and you wanted to be like, which I think is cool. Like, colored belts are awesome. Ranking is awesome. Being able to help other people is even awesomer, right? That's even awesomer. So you remember every person, we talked about it, that you mentioned them, everybody you lost to. This guy armbarred me, this guy choked me out. And those are the lessons. I liked in the 10 questions. Nobody has said this yet, Professor Chet. The most effective move is patience. But it's true, like, all of us would know that when you're patient and you have skill and you watch, then yeah, that's a really good one. The next 5 years, small details, do more with less. Greatest gift, awareness of health. I think we all get to that place. I know Sensei Suino's there, Sensei Legacy and I talk about it a lot. Benson and I have talked about it a lot. Why do you want the health? It's probably symbiotic. You want to do your art more. I just want to be healthy so I can do this more, right? Greatest achievement, helping others that are shy or have been bullied. That's a really nice thing. Nobody else has said that either, even though I think we all relate to it. We've learned that lesson from you. I don't relate to, you said you regret the people you hurt. I regret it for maybe a couple of people, but there's some I'm really happy about it, to be honest with you. I just gotta say, there's a couple people I hurt where I'm like, I'm so happy I hurt that person, but I'm basically a jerk, right? So history repeats itself. You said that. The risk of students being spoon-fed, right? And no instructor equals more work. I don't think you can argue that. And then the last thing you related to us about Grand Master Helio, train for your worst day. And you got to come on your worst day if you're going to train for your worst day. And so many people don't come on their worst day. They had a bad day and they just use that as an excuse to not come. You got to train on your worst days if you want to be prepared for your worst days. Thank you so much, Professor Chet. I know we're going to cross paths. I can't wait to meet you and shake your hand. And you can have my back and choke me out. I'll be excited if that can happen. And I can say that I can learn from you.
Thanks, Sensei Dauphin. I just want to say what a pleasure this is. You know, I wrote down everything they said and I'd be reiterating, so I don't want to take too much time with that, but I'm not sure I was a good host tonight because there's not one thing you mentioned that I didn't want to break open into another 10 minutes. There's not one thing you mentioned where I said, no, we need to go down this road. I almost think you needed somebody who was, you know, like, I just wanted to know every detail about everything. And I do, like Sensei Suino said, feel like we didn't even scratch the surface. And it was still such a beautiful and in-depth chat about, you know, it's cool because we got to touch on the history and your history. Yours not enough, but while you were talking about the people you trained with, you gave us so much information about the way you see it, you think about it, and you were doing it. And I think that's a gift, the way you quietly describe those things. So what do you want to go out on? What do you want to say?
Oh man, I'm honored to be able to do something like this. And I got to watch a few episodes that you guys have done in the past. So I really, really think this is a cool thing. Especially for other people that are into martial arts already, or even maybe just thinking about trying it. Like sometimes I always think it's interesting how when I ask someone, you know, hey, you could come in, I give a free class or a free 10-day trial, whatever. And they're always like, yeah, the UFC stuff, or I don't want to get punched in the nose, and it's always interesting how people make things out to be much worse than they are until they do them, right? Like our imagination, and I even felt that when I was fighting, like there would be some guys and they'd say they'd done this or that, and then my mind, it became this huge monster that I was, and then they turn out to be one of my easiest fights. So it's always interesting how perception of the unknown can keep us from doing things, and how can we as a collective, right, is like I try to encourage my students, not only for my business, but just for people in general to, you know, it's okay to bring somebody into a class, try this, try to do something that makes you feel healthy or good. You know, I mean, the technology is a great thing, but I think people are starting to get a little too docile with the technology, right? And they're not active enough. So, and maybe that's part of the problem with all the political noise and rhetoric, and everybody seems to be unhappy. It's like, you know, when I look out at the mat and I see there's 20 guys out on the mat, and each one of them comes from a different religious background, and there's different races, and there's different cultures, and there's men and there's women, and they're all helping each other improve. It's like, man, when I see that, that's what I believe it'd be something like America, or, you know, this is what freedom is, where we can be humans with each other in that collective act of giving and helping others, and then receiving the benefits from it. And I don't know, I just feel like whether it's jiu-jitsu or karate or judo or whatever the martial art is, that act of doing something to improve yourself is a very powerful thing for humans. And I don't know, if you could put a task on anybody, this is what Helio gave me as a task, was that I was to go teach people, spread the art, spread this art of mine that's for the old and the weak, and help the people that need help, right? So I think sometimes as school owners, we like that super athletic person that's going to do great things, but yet we can't overlook the person that's shy, that's thinking about coming in, you know, that they're sitting out in their car, like peek out the door and like wave at them, like, hey, what's up? Come on in, you know, and or even somebody coming in and I feel they're really nervous when they come in. It's like, hey, if you want, just watch a class, sit down, ask me any questions you want, you know, and just try to let them see the vibe that we have. And I don't know, I'd like to see more people doing martial arts because I've gained so much from it. And I think there's so much for us to learn. And I still have more to learn, but I don't know. This stuff like this, I think, just goes a long way to pushing that. Even for the people that watch it, thinking, man, I should ask my brother. Maybe he could use that. You know, so love it.
Thank you, Professor. What a wonderful thing to go out on. I'm going to say some thanks right now and then throw it to Sensei Dauphin to tell us what's coming up and say goodnight for us. So I just want to say thanks to Robert Schlumsky running our show tonight. From south of the 49th, Mike Russell, Victoria Feth, Justin Shea, Alden Adair, and Andrei Sedashev. This show does not work without you. Sensei Dauphin, what do we got coming up?
Got another host chat coming up. And then I'm going to actually, there's a name that we're going to have on, Jean Fernet, Sensei Legacy, and I saw him in Ottawa. I don't know him really well. In Ottawa, I've met him a couple of times in tournaments and things, but in Ottawa is the only time I got to talk to him. I think Benson, you and he will have a lot in common because he's done like 56 or 57 motion pictures.
Amazing.
But I mean, I say that that's not what he is. He's a martial artist. I mean, I watched this tape of him where he was doing this stuff and I was like, unbelievable. Sensei, you've known him longer, you've seen him more, like, do you have any comments about Jean Fernet?
He was excellent at katas. He's probably the first guy that came out and he did the Eye of the Tiger, you know, with the roundhouse kicks and all that. He was, had great kicks, a great showman. I'm not sure that I've seen him fighting.
Yeah. But we're going to chat with him. Yeah. I honestly, like, he's in the top 10 people I've ever seen kick. Like, yeah. I mean, standing like this and his leg is like that, like straight over his head. And then he does it like 752 times in a row, right? Like, just like ridiculous. Yeah, so that's what's coming up, Sean.
Awesome. That's great. I'm so stoked and I'm so excited for the night we just had. And I love that we're expanding the different martial arts we're talking to. So thanks again, Professor Chet. It was a real honor to have you. And
thanks, Professor Chet.
So grateful for your time and for everybody watching. Good night, everybody. Be safe and we'll see you on the next one.
Peace.